Hello and welcome to my morning note. Let's take a look to the long term today. The world faces an energy crisis. We all know that the demand for energy is going to continue to increase inexorably, and so are the emissions into the atmosphere. What are we going to do about it? Now, in the last few years, the answer has been to exploit shale gas in the US, but there's only so far that can go. For the future, my guest today suggests that what we could see for the next decade or two is a big investment mega trend in energy efficiency. He's B of A Merrill Lynch's thematic strategist, Sarbjit Nahal. Sarbjit, thank you very much for coming in today. Let's start by taking a look at the value of energy consumption going back quite a long way into the 60s. Does this point to you towards a imminent destruction of demand?
Well, I think it's quite worrying, John. As you said, energy demand is set to increase by a minimum of a third and anywhere up to 50% over the course of the next 20 years.
Right.
90% of that demand is going to be coming from emerging markets, 60% from China, India, and the Middle East alone.
Which already have terrible pollution problems.
Exactly.
So where we are here is we're approaching a level of about 9%, where we've seen sharp falls the last two times it's been reached. Why has that happened these last two times? How is it going to happen?
That's right. And from our perspective, we think particularly emerging markets cannot afford to be paying 7 to 9% of their nominal GDP in energy costs. And what's particularly worrying, and what we have to keep in mind, is that 70 to 80% of oil in particular is a transport fuel. And we don't see any near-term substitution for that.
Okay, so we're not going to be talking about battery-operated cars for the near term. We need to come up with some other
We
solution.
think that they're going to continue to grow, but that the focus needs to be on the traditional internal combustion engine, so more efficient gas and diesel engines.
Okay, now let's illustrate the scale of the issue with for cars. This is the number of vehicles per person in various countries, and what's perhaps startling is to see exactly how far behind and implicitly how much more demand there's going to be in countries like India and China. Now, how are they going to deal with the energy that involves?
Well, I think there's two perspectives here. We can see that China is quite low on this chart, but that's changing rapidly. China currently has about 100 million vehicles on the road. By the early 2030s, we're expecting about 300 million. Now, not only does this become an energy efficiency issue, but it becomes an energy security issue. Assuming we don't see any significant efficiency improvements, China could be looking at an additional oil bill of 2 million barrels per day.
So what kind of companies do you invest in to harness what China is going to need to do?
Well, we think some of the low-hanging fruits, things like downsizing the engine and adding in a turbocharger. You improve the efficiency by 20 to 30%, you reduce CO2 emissions by 20%, and the incremental cost per vehicle is 5 to 10% the cost of a hybrid motor assist. There's also opportunities around things like lightweighting. Reduce the weight by 10%, you improve the efficiency by 7%.
Okay, so much less sexy than people coming up with battery-operated cars, but perhaps more of an immediate gain.
Exactly, particularly in developed markets.
Okay, now let's switch to the world's prime gas guzzler, which is, of course, the US. This is a startling chart showing how many miles are driven on highways in the US each year. Remarkably impervious to recessions. What has happened? This looks like a very real change in behaviour in the last 5 or 6 years. What's going on in the States?
That's right. We're starting to see a bit of a sea change in the States, particularly in terms of regulations. In August of last year, both the EPA and the Department of Transport jointly regulated on new emissions and fuel economy standards. So by 2025, we're going to be looking at 56 miles per gallon for US cars.
Wow, and now that's being justified on an economic basis rather than on an environmental basis, which in the US is still very controversial.
It's a little bit of both. You know, President Obama's administration, the arguments they made when this piece of legislation came out was, first, it's going to save the consumer about $2 billion per year at the gas pump, and secondly, it's going to reduce America's dependence on foreign oil by about 12 billion barrels.
And how much further can that trend persist? How much further do you need to do to invest in this?
I think there's still a long way to go. The US, with this most recent move, has now moved into line with what Europe, Korea is doing in this space, and increasingly we're going to be looking at things like 65, probably 70 miles per gallon, or for instance in Europe, 95 grams of CO2 per kilometre.
Okay, Sarbjit, thank you very much indeed. We only really scratched the surface there. There are huge issues for energy efficiency in buildings, for example, and many other areas. They're all covered in a rather enormous report that Sarbjit produced for Merrill's, but I do think the bottom line is it's hard to spot exactly who the winners are, but there's plainly a very important trend here that has to be followed.